All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. I just want to thank everyone out there for joining us for this evening's event. I'm Emily. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's. And before we begin, I just have a couple quick announcements. I want to remind you to check out our lineup of upcoming events online at powells.com. And please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So tonight, we are very honored to welcome David Gessner. He's the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, All the Wild That Remains. He's taught environmental writings as a Briggs Copeland lecturer at Harvard and is currently a professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. In his new book, Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness, the acclaimed writer and naturalist brings us a deep, balanced consideration of Teddy Roosevelt and an intimate look at the conservationist in chief, with his strengths, flaws, and accomplishments, that also gives us a playbook for how to protect our wild spaces. A little later in this event, uh, Teddy Roosevelt himself is going to be joining, or actually, Teddy Roosevelt impersonator Larry Marple, as the former president wasn't actually available. And this is also going to include an audience Q&A. Please remember there's an audience Q&A module at the bottom of your screen, and please do get your questions in early. We're going to be going to Q&A early this evening. As well, if there's a question you particularly want to know the answer to, please consider upvoting it to make sure that it gets answered. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting David and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. I'll be purchasing a link to buy the book in the chat a couple of times this evening. And David, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Emily. It's great to be here. As we said before, it's sad not to actually be at Powell's. One of my best memories was the first time I came, where Brian Doyle, great author, Portland author, we drank a couple of beers out in front and came in. And Brian and I knew each other actually through basketball and ultimate frisbee in the old days. And we were the only two writers in our group. And to talk about writing with somebody who loved writing as much as I did was huge. As we said, or as Emily said, if you want to ask a question, chat in, because Larry, AKA Teddy Roosevelt, and I have been doing this a lot, and we're kind of bored with ourselves. So we want to go in a different direction than we usually do. Years ago, I wrote a book called Sick of Nature. And I've been saying that everybody should call their next book Sick of the Last Book, because you write the book, you're totally obsessed with it, and then you go and kind of publicize it. And by the end, you're like, all right, I'm ready for something new. The weird thing about this book, of course, has been Teddy Roosevelt's been dead for quite a while, as you probably know, but he's been crazily in the news. His daughter Alice said of him that he wanted to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. And sure enough, he's been like that. We've had, Trump mentioning Teddy all the time, Trump talking about Yosemite or Yoseminite. We've had Roosevelt's statue go down at we had statue go down last night in your town, but we had his statue being considered to go down in American Museum of Natural History. It's just been a kind of crazy example of how his ability to kind of get attention is, in a more positive sense, almost comparable with our current president's ability to be a sinkhole for attention. They, of course, have a lot in common, as people have pointed out to me, and as I point out in the book. Namely, they're both New York born, silver spoon in mouth. They both had small hands, actually. That's true too. And a lot in common, but they're just so different. Their differences really define them. Roosevelt, for all his kind of pampered upbringing and his early privileged start, becomes this creature of empathy and a creature of growth, despite his statue coming down last night in Portland. And despite some really deep flaws, which I discuss in the book, there's also this kind of excitement to this person who is, in Wallace Stegner's word, a grower, who's constantly like kind of learning new things. He's writing, and he writes like 47 books while being president, while being a big birder, while rushing into a cabinet meeting and saying to his cabinet members, I've got some big news. I just saw a chestnut-sided warbler, and it's only February. So he's got all these interests. And though a hunter who kills animals, he's also our greatest proponent of wildness and wild animals as president, and saves, of course, 230 million acres of public land, which is just crazy. So I thought I'd talk. I'm going to bring Teddy himself in fairly quickly, but I thought I'd talk for a minute about how the book was born. It's very hard, as I'm learning, for a book to get any airspace in the current age of Trump, where every day seems to bring a new shock. But I really believe that the issues in the book, big picture wise, are more important than the issues of the moment. That moment being whatever happened today. And in a lot of ways, the book was born of the fact that many of my writer friends were doing kind of knee-jerk reactions to whatever Trump did back in 2017. And I said, I want to do a deeper dive. I want to do a longer rebuttal on an issue that I care so much about, which is public lands, and the fact that I believe the lands, saved lands, are kind of our Noah's Ark, our way to fight back against climate change. And a couple bizarro things happened early on that led to this book being written. One was in late 2016, I was asked by Kirsten Allen and Tory House Press and Stephen Trimble, who also was working with Tory House Press, to contribute to an anthology that was that was fighting for Bears Ears National Monument, that would be distributed to all members of Congress. It was called Red Rock Testimony. And it was about our love for the part of Southeast Utah that would become Bears Ears National Monument. Now, there were a lot of Western writers, there were Native writers, and I was kind of the token Easterner. And to tell the quick backstory, I'd moved west when I was 30. I had testicular cancer in my hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts, and kind of had broken out of the East and moved west. Literally cried when I saw the Rockies as I headed west. And part of my time in the West was exploring Southeast Utah. So I wrote a piece that was part of that book too. And it was a moment of real empowerment for me and many others when that book was read by Congress, and when ultimately in December of 2016, Barack Obama declared Bears Ears a national monument. So that was a thrilling moment, much more for local people and for the 5 tribes, which I'll get into since we're celebrating Indigenous people today, the 5 tribes that created Bears Ears. So that happens, I'm lifted up. Well, I get slammed to the ground 10 months later when on Theodore Roosevelt's, what would have been his 159th birthday, October 27th, 2017, then Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke, undeclares Bears Ears, 85% of it. In front, there's a little bobblehead of Teddy back there, in front of a portrait of Roosevelt on his birthday, and saying he is a Roosevelt Republican working for Trump, and he undeclares this land. So that for me was the beginning of saying, screw this, I'm going to write a book that combines Bears Ears with the Antiquities Act, which is how one declares a national monument, and which, by the way, in all the large news that's swirling around us, we're forgetting that the Antiquities Act, the fate of that is also potentially going to be decided by the Supreme Court. It's now in a District of Columbia court where we're deciding whether one president can undeclare the land that a previous president has declared. Think of that. think of how that would open up all our saved lands. That's an aside. And I'm going to write a book about that, about Roosevelt, and about the land. And I'm going to head out west to do my original trip to kind of visit that land in early 2018. I go ahead and do that, and through great good fortune, through the advice of Kirsten Allen and others, I go see Regina Lopez White Skunk first. She is a Ute Mountain Ute member of the Bears Ears Tribal Council, and my book totally takes a veer in another direction. And that direction is realizing that this vision of a national monument is totally different than earlier visions, because it comes out of the thinking, the work, the planning, the energy and support of 5 Native American tribes: Navajo, Ute, Ute Mountain Ute, Hopi, and Zuni tribes. So Regina talks to me and says, look, we're not trying to relive historical trauma here. We're not trying to, say this land is ours. We're trying to take a tool that the United States has used to save land and repurpose it basically for this, this new, taking what had been kind of sacred land and meeting ground land for thousands of years for Native tribes and save it as a national monument. And my mind was blown basically. And I said, wow, we can create this confluence between Roosevelt's ideas, which have understandably and justly come under a lot of criticism in recent years. And I go into that in the book, and this native ideal. And we can think of saving public lands in a new way that's more inclusive, that considers that land isn't just for tourism, but it's for use and sacred use. And we can take what was once considered America's best idea, as well as Stegner called the American national parks, and make it better. We can acknowledge that Roosevelt was deeply flawed in some ways, particularly in his attitude toward Native Americans. And I have a chapter about that where I basically say it's the biographer's tendency to make excuses for their subject or to move briskly along. And I just say, this is the problem, and let's let it sit as it is, and let's acknowledge that. But we can take his original vision, his draft, and we can revise it for the present, and we can make it newly exciting, because it was pretty damn exciting to begin with, this idea of putting land aside that nobody had ever heard of before. This was like a novel concept, but we can make it even better for now. And it hinges on this use of the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act was created in 1906, and in the draft of in the language of the Antiquities Act, it talks about the discretion of the president. And I joke in the book that using the word discretion and president in the same sentence when Roosevelt was president was kind of nuts. And Roosevelt just goes and uses the act like it, he's like Captain America with his shield or Thor with his hammer. He's just using it to save more and more land. And I'm going to invite Roosevelt himself on fairly quickly. And I see there's already there he is right here. Teddy, welcome. Let's see what this, and I just think that one of the things that the book does, which I haven't mentioned yet, so I talked about kind of what drove the book, but the structure of the book, it's like kind of 3 levels where there's a biography of you to some degree, there's a state of the environment, and there's my road trip, which occurred in 2018, but mimics the road trip you took in 2003. And in that trip, we started in North Carolina, unlike you. I think you started in Pennsylvania, if I'm right.
Harrisburg, yes.
Yep. And my nephew had just graduated from college, 21 years old, and I took him up the East Coast, and he got to see your house on Long Island, and he didn't like all the dead stuffed heads. But that's his. And I played him your speeches, and he didn't like the phrase manly vigor, but he conceded that you're okay. And then we went to Harvard, and then we went out to the Badlands, and then we went to Medora, where we stopped at a place we thought we were just going to the bathroom, and we ran into, lo and behold, you, Teddy Roosevelt. So I wanted to ask you about and maybe tell the folks about that 1903 trip that you basically traveled the entire country.
Yes, I did. Well, I wanted to tour the West, and in 1901, I had read John Muir's book on our national parks. So one of my goals was to go to Yosemite and have Mr. Muir guide me. So in 1903, in March, we were planning this, and I wrote to Mr. Muir and I asked him to be my guide, that I told him I did not want anyone with me but you. And I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days just to be out in the open with you. So we started on April 1st in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, made our way through Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, through South Dakota. And on April 7th, I went to the town that Mr. Gessner just mentioned, Medora, North Dakota. It was where I had my 2 cattle ranches back when I was a Dakota rancher. We left there. I was with Mr. John Burroughs on that part of the trip. The next day, we arrived at Livingston and Gardner, Montana, both of those. And Mr. Burroughs and I spent 2 weeks going through Yellowstone and camping and just having a bully time. But then we left Yellowstone and headed down through Wyoming, through South Dakota, Nebraska, over through Oklahoma and Iowa, and spent a bit of time in St. Louis, Missouri. Then we headed through Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico. And on May 6th, we arrived at the Grand Canyon in Arizona.
Well, I'll jump in here because the Grand Canyon might have given my book its title.
Yes, it did.
And, for people who didn't know this, like there was nobody really campaigned from the Oval Office before. This gave the name the Whistle Stop Tour.
Yes.
I just said to a friend earlier before we got on that he was asking me about the secret of Teddy, and other than that ebullient personality, coffee had something to do with it.
I drank a gallon of coffee a day.
Yeah, he drank a gallon of coffee a day, and the Maxwell House phrase "good to the last drop" came from a quote of Roosevelt's.
Yes.
And I think Edmund Morris, who died in the last about a year and a half ago now, I guess, so a little more than a year ago, he said that Roosevelt even went to bed energetically. And if you haven't, by all means, buy my book. I hope you do. But if you haven't read Edmund Morris on Theodore Roosevelt, I would deeply encourage you to. It's a contagious sort of biography where you get this sense of, like we just mentioned the Badlands, of when Teddy goes out to the Badlands, he's just lost his wife, he's lost his mom. He goes out there and he throws himself energetically into ranch work. But what I've been thinking about, I'm getting old. Sorry, Teddy, I'm going to wax. I'm about the age you were when you died, actually. I'm 59 now. And I've been like, the pandemic's been getting to me, and my mood. And I think about the way his response, which was not dissimilar to Churchill's, was to hurl himself energetically into things and create a momentum, not just to do things and achieve things, but also for psychological purposes, to live, to not fall into that, that black hole that we can fall into and that we all know about right now.
And my father had taught me to take action. So when things would arise, I took action.
Yeah. No, you did. And the black hair quote. You
Yes.
want to let people
Ah,
know that?
yes, I told my family after the passing of my wife and my mother that black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. So
Yeah.
my goal was to go to the Badlands and outrun the cloud of gloom that had overshadowed me.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about this before, but also there was that doctor who, you saw when you were about 20, who basically said, your heart's not good and and you better take it easy in your life. And you went the opposite route and you thought you were going to live to about 60 and you were
That's
right
what I
on.
told him. Yes. I wish I would have
Um,
said 120.
yeah, I wish you had too. So we got you to the Grand Canyon on that 1903 trip. And it's at the Grand. One thing I try to do in the book is, as I said, I thread those three things, but I also do little kind of interludes where I write in the third person about Roosevelt. And the first one is at the Grand Canyon, where you come that morning. And if you don't mind kind of giving us a little bit of the backstory and maybe giving us this part of the speech that
Yeah.
gives the book its title.
Ah, yes. Now, we arrived at the Grand Canyon, and as I stood at the edge of that majestic canyon, I said that in the Grand Canyon, Arizona has a natural wonder which, so far as I know, is in kind absolutely unparalleled throughout the rest of the world. I want to ask you to do one thing in connection with it, in your own interest and in the interest of the country, to keep this great wonder of nature as it now is. I was delighted to learn of the wisdom of the Santa Fe Railroad people in deciding not to build their hotel on the brink of the canyon. I hope you will not have a building of any kind, not a summer cottage, not a hotel or anything else to mar the wonderful grandeur, the sublimity, the great loneliness, and the beauty of the canyon. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve upon it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. What you can do is keep it for your children and your children's children, and for all who come after you, as one of the great sights which every American, if he can travel at all, should see.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Leave It As It Is the book's title, and it comes from that speech. I think that speech, I call it the equivalent of the environmental Gettysburg Address. That moment where he says, where you say, rather than he says, children's children, really has become a cliche in time since, but at the time, you got to look back and think how novel and intense that was, linking the future of the land to your bloodline going forward. And what you got to remember, when Roosevelt was fighting these fights, he was not just fighting them, he was creating the arena in which they were fought. This was an unheard of thing. It's one of the top 3 priorities in his 7 years in office was conservation. Imagine that, a president right now, think of the debates, even the vice presidential debates, where everybody's afraid to mention the environment, even though we're up against it right now. It's so important to save this land. People are cowardly about it. And Roosevelt wasn't driven by the polls. He was driven by this passion. And that to me is really impressive. I also like the phrase, leave it as it is. My wife tried to take this pile of books I had on the front table of our house, and I said, leave it as it is. And she didn't like it, but they also tried to change the title of the book. And I wrote a long letter that ended, of course, leave it as it is. And they did, which is nice that they did that. So we were saying this, we're back in this road trip, and my road trip takes place in 2018. Teddy's is in 1903. And as he pointed out, one of the kind of climax of the trip occurs when he runs into John Muir out in California. And this crazy thing happens. Imagine a president, not our current one, but a president going on a camping trip in the middle of and so can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Oh, I'd be delighted. Yeah. Well, May 7th, we headed into California and traveled all through the state. And finally, on May 15th, we arrived at Raymond, California, and I was there with Mr. Muir, and of all the people of the world, it was Mr. Muir that I wanted to see Yosemite with. So our first night was spent at Mariposa Grove under the grizzly giant. I had 40 wool army blankets for my bedding, and the next evening, we camped on May 16th at Sentinel Dome. We had a snowstorm that night with about 5 inches of snow that fell upon us. But we had a bully time. With one exception, Mr. Muir kept trying to put little twigs in the buttonholes of my coat constantly. I would brush them off, but no, we had great discussions. And on May 17th, we camped at the edge of Bridal Veil Meadow in the Yosemite Valley. Mr. Muir's main focus was the preservation for the forest, but he also had concern that the California state grant of Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove, which surrounded in 1892 by Yosemite National Park, that those areas be receded back to the United States. Our discussion prompted me in June of 1906 to declare the Yosemite Recession Bill. This took the Yosemite Valley grant and the Mariposa Big Tree Grove from state protection to federal protection as part of the Yosemite National Park. But no, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Mr. Muir.
I love that camping trip led to practical saving of land. And, I write about that as, in a kind of third person bit too. And one of the things I try to do in it is suddenly I show up at the fire because I like to write about myself. So I pop in there and, talk to them about how things have changed since then. Obviously, another way that this book is relevant is John Muir being semi-canceled this summer, though that's a whole long discussion in terms of what actually, what he's being accused of versus what he did. And I think one thing that the book is about is, for lack of a better term, the cancel culture. And one thing I've written about in the weeks since the book came out is how we tend to act like amateur St. Peters and consign people to heaven or hell, and that we don't take the messiness, complexity, hypocrisy of all of us and what good is achieved and what where we fall short. And I understand why we don't do that. I understand the moral impulse, but I do feel like historical empathy is an important virtue, and that's a whole nother discussion which I'm happy to get into. I'd love to just because we're sick of, as much as we love each other, Teddy, we've been doing this for a while.
Oh, yes.
I'd love to respond to any questions people have in any directions they want to go. That would be terrific. I know we're a little early to do that, but between the two of us, we can always fill up airspace with our words.
How many hours do you
I'm not as competitive as you are, but man, one of the fascinating things about Roosevelt in my reading was how much you loved to talk. What a good listener, you were too. And another thing that people don't realize who try to take him down is you were a good friend to many men and women, even in the midst of the politics and everything else that was going on. And that's pretty impressive, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Emily's with us now too.
Yes.
I am.
She is the only one not wearing glasses here, though in the future, no doubt, she'll be wearing glasses also. So.
I think I already need them. I do the thing too much.
I do that frequently.
But I'm going to be reading audience questions. So please do put any questions that you have into the Q&A here, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. So I've got one here from Lynn. And she wants to know, do you see any connection between the Eastern urban parks movement, like Central Park, and TR's novel idea of setting aside land?
I'll let TR himself speak, but definitely. because we have, these things came from the same origins, obviously, in the time. But I think one thing that's interesting, one thing that kind of sets it apart from, Central Park was one of the reasons TR was saying, leave it as it is at the edge of the Grand Canyon, because he was reacting against Niagara Falls, which for conservationists, preservationists of the time was the nightmare of tourism, like was, the worst thing that could happen. And then something else happened. If you watch the Ken Burns documentaries, you see a lot of emphasis on, can you give me the exact phrase, but it's for the enjoyment of what's the phrase on
for the
Yellowstone Arc? It's for the enjoyment and
for the benefit and enjoyment of all people.
Right.
Correct.
Well, that's the kind of sign, and that's the kind of political thing. But I think there was a secret agenda, because when he went there, he wasn't going to see Old Faithful. He wasn't looking for, the gaudy touristy places. He cared about the wild, big carnivores there. And my thing in the book is to say, if you go to Yellowstone now, you see, you get caught in a wildlife traffic jam. You think, oh my God, this is a nightmare, millions of people visiting. But if you go a mile off of the road, you're suddenly in real wilderness still and wildness. And one of the most encouraging things to me in this overall very depressing time is that all the big carnivores have come back there. And also I write about Y2Y, which is the Yellowstone to Yukon pathway, migratory pathway, which is an idea that Roosevelt would have loved, I think, which is, conservation biologists say that islands are where species go to die and parks are islands. What if you connect parks? What if you create this migratory pathway? And the Y2Y has done just that, including overpasses, vegetated overpasses, over highways and underpasses below. So it is the Eastern ideal, yes, but it's also blown out in the way that the Western ideal is always the bigger one, right? Because of space and size. And I end the book flying over the West and just going, you know what? True. No doubt about fires, no doubt about drought, no doubt about beetles, no doubt about all the bad stuff, but there's still space. There's still possibility there, which we can't forget, and which Roosevelt knew, which is this possibility that if we manage to do things right, we can have this kind of Noah's Ark, this place that can save species. So I don't know.
We did with the bison, the buffalo. We
sure did. I see one right over your shoulder there.
Ah, yes. But no, we ended up, they were hunted almost to the point of extinction out in the Badlands and the West. And we were able to save some and actually increase the herd at the Bronx Zoo. So yes. We were able to reintroduce the bison back to the West from the Bronx. So
and those bison are part of what they're reintroducing in Canada and the Y2Y, yes. That same strain. Hey, Emily, can I take this one about what would TR do about climate change? Because that speaks very much to the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got a couple of questions related to that. Go for it.
So I mentioned that Roosevelt, look, obviously, I mean, I don't know what you're over. I see we have got 85 people, so I don't know what the overall politics are, but let's just say that Roosevelt was very good. I mean, he was as Teddy knows, one of my favorite quotes is "reading is like a disease for me," right?
Yes.
He was a huge reader and writer and thinker, but he was also very good at distilling that to a message that appealed to people overall. So he was reading and thinking and to a degree an intellectual, but he was able to use direct language that excited people. And he did that with the national parks and with saving public land. He told people why they needed an issue they had no idea they needed. So what we're dealing with climate change is an issue that nobody, my buddy Bill McKibben, who was my college classmate, he was the editor of the Harvard Crimson when I was the political cartoonist. As much as I love him, nobody's been able to, and Uncle Al Gore and nobody's really been able to put it in a way that just makes people go, this has to be the fight. And Roosevelt, I believe, had the language, the energy, the drive, and the lack of concern with fucking polls to just do that, to like put it in such a way where people are like, you know what? You, 45-year-old man, 60-year-old man, might not believe this. I'll tell you what, my 17-year-old daughter believes it. My students in college believe it. They believe this is the fight ahead, and somebody has to articulate it and put it in a way where you have to fight fossil fuels with the passion that he fought the trusts and the railroads and the big business. I mean, he was not afraid of them. And imagine having a president like that right now. Sorry, I got fired up, Ken.
Yeah. Well, during my presidency, I said there can be no greater issue than the conservation of our natural wonders. And I was able to encourage our nation, even though I had to fight Congress for it frequently, especially Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, who said not 1 cent for scenery. So,
and you kind of screwed him. You did that sneaky move with
the midnight forest.
The midnight saving millions of acres at the last minute. So.
Well, I'm going to ask you this question because I love it. This is from Shelley, and I think it ties into the last one. And it's, what camping trip, in quotation marks, would TR recommend to our current politicians?
I would say the two that I did when I went to Yellowstone with Mr. Burroughs, although we sadly don't have Mr. Burroughs with us now.
Hey, I could do it. I could sub in.
Go. Yes. And I think Yosemite, to go to those places and see the cathedral of the trees, as Mr. Muir and I discussed, to see the grandeur, the sublimity, as I said, at the Grand Canyon. I think that is such a moving experience that it changes a person. So I think that would help them.
I don't know if it could change the current guy, but it could change somebody. Obama did, and I can't remember it. Somebody in the audience, I'm sure, can remember. What's that guy, Vern Gills or something, like the outside guy? He went to Alaska with the guy on the TV show, the Survivor TV show. But
Bear Grylls.
Yeah, he did. And they ate, woodchucks or whatever, and but it wasn't quite the same. But you know what? Obama, this by declaring Bears Ears at the end of his term was a huge thing. And by the way, everybody was appalled that he did it at the end of the term. That was a complete tradition started by Teddy, followed through by other politicians. Yeah. Other presidents throughout. And the other kind of thing that has become part of the whole tradition of declaring national monuments, which, by the way, I don't know if we mentioned this, but unlike national parks, it's completely at the discretion of the president. He declares it, and that's why it's kind of the president's superpower. But the other thing that often happens, and this is an example with Grand Staircase Escalante, which also was reduced by Trump, is something is declared. There were these howls of oh, you can't do that, government interference, everybody's upset. And the local people are often upset because they're kind of stirred up. Come back 20 years later, and for instance, in the case of Grand Staircase Escalante, people are like, oh my God, how could they have ever been upset? And our economy's booming because we're on the edge of this beautiful national park. So there's this, this is also part of national monument. I remember I had a trip up to the National Seashore north of me in the Outer Banks, and I ran into a guy. I walked for like 10 miles alone, ran into this guy fishing. He was the only guy on the beach, and his great grandparents had lived there. And he said, oh yeah, they were furious when they created a national seashore here. They were angry. but look at this, look what we have now. And that generally tends to be where both, and this is an important point, both conservatives and liberals go, because I do feel like this is one issue where if we leave the extreme aside, there's real common ground that we historically, in the wake of the Civil War, it was an important healing aspect. It's always been not just a liberal issue; it's a American issue, really.
And with the national monuments, I declared my first national monument in 1906. It was Devil's Tower. And my last of the 18 that I declared was Mount Olympus, which is now Olympic National Park. That was in 1909, the last few months of my presidency. So,
well, it's interesting too, because that's also a kind of trope, a way of the way national monuments, they often are a halfway house to becoming a national park. The president declares them as a monument and then they become a park. Devil's Tower, of course, interesting in another way, in that it was native ground and was originally known as Bear's Lodge by native tribes. And so it was an example of taking away native land, which of course Teddy in his time wasn't as aware of. And Bear's Ears is a kind of corrective to Bear's Lodge, the Devil's Tower, which is also famous for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I like this about Biden with Tom Udall. Eddie Udall, throw a Udall in there and I'm good. I was a Mo Udall fan in the old days.
It's a good question. We've got another one from an anonymous attendee who is asking, are there lands that you wish had been set aside during your administration but weren't?
Oh, well, we tried with the forest, as Mr. Gessner mentioned, that when Congress presented me with the bill that I knew they had the votes to override a veto for, Mr. Gifford Pinchot, my chief of forestry, we sat down and declared as much land as we had been thinking of to preserve as national forest. And so that was why we called them the Midnight Forest. We signed all of those into national land and then signed their useless bill into law. But no, there's a number of lands that were on the planning stage. But my thankfulness is that of my national monuments, a good number of those ended up becoming national parks, including the Grand Canyon, among others. So there's always more you wish you could do, but I tried to do what I could with what I had where I was.
And it's interesting because we mentioned John Muir before. So you have Gifford Pinchot on one shoulder of Teddy and John Muir on the other. And Pinchot is more practical and pragmatic. Kind of the phrase wise use was usurped by conservative groups, but back then it just meant, we're going to use this. But Pinchot is also underrated because I write in the book, there's a stat which if we had kept cutting down our forests at the rate we were cutting them down when Roosevelt came in, we would have denuded the entire land within a decade. So even though Pinchot was a wise use person, he'd been schooled in European forestry. He wasn't there to like clear cut the whole place. So.
And Mr. Muir wanted only preservation, no use at all, just leave it as it is. So.
We've got another one. TR had a famous quote about daring greatly.
Yes.
He had many quotes about daring greatly. You want to do a little of our, man in the arena, maybe?
I'd be delighted to.
That's a great, and it really works. When you guys listen to this, think of the cancel culture and where we are right now. And what about, anyway, I'll shut up.
No. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man, and today to the woman, who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Fully.
Exactly. That's what I mean. That's very good.
That was excellent. A follow-up question from the audience. Teddy, did you intend future generations to modify the national parks program, or did you want them kept exactly as you made them? For example, did you ever think about returning those parks to the states instead of federal jurisdiction?
Well, once they were saved, I was hopeful that they would be saved. And just as I said at the Grand Canyon, to leave it as it is. But I know some of my parks were sent back as the Platte National Park in Oklahoma. It's now part of the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. So some of those have been ceded back to the states as state parks. And as long as they're preserved, I'm fine with that. I just want the land preserved in the best way possible so that the most people can get the greatest benefit of that, and that our children's children will still have them many years from now. So.
And state parks are different than states' rights and states. This is a fight that Roosevelt was part of early on, but Bernard DeVoto in the 1950s, 40s is a great, he's a part of my book too, where he kind of ridicules what has become the long cliche of the West about like, give us our lands back. Well, in fact, the tradition from the beginning was for public lands, our lands, to be part of the state. It was actually part of the deal about joining the Union to have that. And one of the things that I write about a lot is how these beautiful wide open countries are also kind of wide open socialism in this extent that ranchers get to lease this public land for cheap and use it as their own, and it becomes their own fiefdoms. So Bernard DeVoto had a great line where he talked about the Western rebels, and he said their motto should be get out and give us money, because they wanted their independence, but they also wanted the support of the United States. So that's another thing that kind of evolved, where this constant cry you hear of give us our lands back. Well, they're not your lands, they're our lands. They're the lands of all Americans, and that is a hollow cry.
So let's get to another one here. I think this is related, so I'm going to ask this one now. This is from Lucas in the audience. What would TR think of the current debate about public lands and multiple competing land uses?
Well, as I said, Mr. Pinchot and I believed in the wise use of the land, that conservation of the land, as long as it's conserved so that its usefulness is intact, but it preserves its wonder and beauty. So, no, that's, as long as it's used wisely and not, as long as the malefactors of wealth don't rob the land of its beauty and strip it of any desirous effect. I want it preserved. Yes.
And I think that, to some degree, and we've had conversations with other groups about this, a large scale version of zoning. I've had people tell me in like Southeast Utah, you've got the ATV users, and you've got there needs to be places where you truly leave it as it is. And that's not just, and that includes recognizing that recreation is a threat too. As Wallace Stegner said, you could love a place to death. Where you truly need to leave it as it is. I mentioned the wilderness corridors. You need to let evolution continue to evolve. You need to have places that are like that. But in a real world, you also can conceivably have this place where this is done and this place where that is done. In fact, we were talking earlier, and since, we're in Portland, which is the, fairly extreme place, I just did a piece for the Washington Post where I talk about the middle path that Roosevelt walked. Now, anytime you say middle, it sounds kind of milk toasty and, oh, this is no good. But the path he walked, he thought of it as a ridge between, along a peak. And on one side, as Teddy just mentioned, the malefactors of wealth, the criminal elite, he called them, that where only money and success mattered.
Yeah.
But the other side was dangerous to him too, which were the dogmatic kind of believers in impractical just ideals. And to get anything done in the world, he needed to go through that. He believed in these liberal ideals, but he also knew that he couldn't be dogmatic about them. However, the piece ends with me saying, if it came between the two, who he disliked more, he talked about the elite criminal class. He talked about a particular type who was who cared only about success and only achieved it through chicanery and cheating and stood toward society as a wild beast. And I just kind of leave it there, assuming people know what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about.
So here's one from Julie in the audience asking, Mr. Roosevelt, what's your opinion of Mount Rushmore?
Well, I knew Mr. Gutzon Borglum. He supported me in my 1912 presidential campaign, but I did not know that he was planning to put me on the side of a mountain. No, I believe my legacy is more important than any mountain or statue. And those are the things I focus on, the legacy and the things that I spoke to people, the things that I wrote in my books, the ideals that I shared with the American people. But no, I mean, I am honored that he put me up there, but although
would you like to have Donald Trump next to you up there?
Oh, I'm much too wise a man to involve myself in modern politics.
Well, it's funny because one of the things that I've written about is, I wrote a piece saying, take down Teddy's statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History, because it is, if you see it, it's like him on a horse with an African man and a native man behind him, and it's just next to him, and it's awful. And he would have probably supported that. I don't know if I don't want to speak for you, Teddy, but on the other hand, the Museum of Natural History has renamed its Hall of Biodiversity after Roosevelt. So that kind of speaks to Don's question about cancel culture, which is they are acknowledging the complexity of the person. And an important part of the book is when Roosevelt was 14, he didn't want to be president. He didn't want to be a soldier. He wanted to be a naturalist, like his hero, Charles Darwin. And he wrote, his writing life came alive in part because he was writing about birds and animals. And so to me, what Roosevelt did, he had the prejudices of his time for sure. And one deep prejudice toward Native people, in part because he perceived them as in the way in the Manifest Destiny's March to the West. But one prejudice he did not share was anthropocentrism. He did not believe man was the end all be all. He saw beyond the human into a larger world. And part of that was his training as a naturalist. The other part was the time he spent in the wilderness. So it's complicated, and that speaks to Don's question. And I really do believe that we have every right to go back and say, you were wrong about this. I do that in the book. But we also have to have historical empathy. We have to be able to say, it's just common sense. We don't expect people to be talking about gravity before Newton. We don't expect people to be aware of things that they wouldn't be aware of. And we know that, I mean, if we're not being extreme about it.
Well, and one thing, my views of the Native Americans changed with my service with the Rough Riders, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. We had over 60 of them on the roster for the regiment. And one of the men, a Pawnee, was the man who I had illustrate the pictures in the letters that I sent home to my children of our time in Cuba. But no, at the Grand Canyon, I did say that all I ask is a square deal for every man. Give him a fair chance. Do not let him wrong anyone, and do not let him be wrong.
Well, you also said this country won't be truly evolved until we have a Black president and a Jewish president, and and you also were one of the early proponents for universal suffrage. So,
Yes.
I mean, and then right next to that, you can put the negatives too. And I just think it's simplistic to think that a person is one thing or another. And as I said, consign them to heaven or hell.
Oh, yes.
We're messy. I'm sure they're going to take me down for stuff too. I'm feeling it already. So maybe tonight, maybe this will be it. Maybe I said something tonight that I'm going to be tweeted to hell in the next couple of days.
I think we've got time for just a couple more here. So I'm going to ask you kind of the second part of this question from Martha in the audience, because I know, Teddy, you talked about your reaction when you first saw the Grand Canyon. So the follow-up there, David, what was your reaction when you first saw the Grand Canyon? And Teddy, any reaction to the changes there now if you saw it today?
Well, I write about Roosevelt's seeing the canyon. And one of the things I try to do in the book is talk about, like, one of the reasons I go to the places he went is, as a writer who cares about nature and place, I feel like you can't know a person unless you know their places. And I take my nephew on this trip, and he's 21 and he sees the West for the first time. I was about the same age when I went west and saw the Grand Canyon. And, sometimes things are cliche because they're true. And the overwhelming sense of seeing that great bruise-like, shape, and just like, am I going to fall into it? Am I going to come back? I remember that. In fact, I have journal notes from that because I was already keeping a journal. And I used those in writing the scene where Roosevelt first sees it, because he's written his speech in the train rushing to the Grand Canyon. And I believe he revised it after riding up there on horseback that morning before he gave the speech and seeing it. And by the way, Teddy, you impressed the people you were with, because even though you weren't from the region, you already knew the names of the birds there. And you didn't like the fact that Muir didn't know his birds well.
Oh, I know. Now Mr. Muir could identify all the flora and all the trees, but no, with Mr. Burroughs, he and I raced through Yellowstone identifying the bird calls.
I like that about you.
No, thank you. No, I think my last trip there was in 1914, so it may have changed a bit since then. But when I was there with my son Quentin, we thoroughly enjoyed our time. We rode down into the canyon and just had a bully time there, and just the majestic, the sublimity, as I said in the speech, the magnificence of that canyon. Yeah, so I do need to make another trip out there soon. After 106 years, I think it may have changed. Hopefully, no buildings on the rim of the canyon.
I know we're getting to the end, but I just want to mention this question from Gene, I think, about John Wesley Powell, who continues, first of all, is very much in the heroic tradition of, like, this. He had one arm that he'd lost one in the Civil War, and he went down the Grand Canyon. And the lineage, I mentioned Bernard DeVoto, from Powell to DeVoto to Wallace Stegner. These were people who realistically saw the West for what it was, not this kind of fake paradise, but this arid place, a desert or semi-desert in a lot of places where you needed water to survive. And they, like Roosevelt, came at it as scientists and naturalists. And that's the other thing about Roosevelt. How nice would it be to have a president who listened to science and listened to scientists and respected them and was one himself? So John Wesley Powell is also a hero of mine. And, there's a great Wallace Stegner biography. My previous book was about Wallace Stegner and Ed Abbey, and I love that lineage. And it really, it goes back to Roosevelt as one of the founders of that lineage.
Well, I'm going to follow this up with just one last question for both of you here, and I'm going to use this question in the chat and add a bit of my own here. But David, I think one of the great things that you've always done with your books is kind of fire people up to want to make a change about this thing, and I think that's a lot of what I've taken away from tonight is, well, how do we preserve this legacy? So to the question in the audience, and to my question, both of you, like, what would your message be to young people today, or just to people in general who want to try and do something to preserve this legacy?
Well, I wouldn't have written, as I mentioned, I'm almost at your last year, Teddy. I'm 59 at this point. I can't believe I'm 59, but apparently it just happens when you keep living.
It goes quickly.
Yeah, but this book wouldn't have happened without my 17-year-old daughter, Hadley, and one of my students, Lindsay, I don't know if she's here tonight, who started Sunrise, which is the Bill McKibben youth group. And I listened to them and I heard them talk about climate change in a way, for me, I read about it when McKibben's book came out, whatever, 25 years ago. I've thought about it mostly theoretically, even though I have a writing shack behind my house where I've watched the water rise, it's still theoretical. And I listened to them and my God, it was personal, it was anxious. We just took our first road trip and we drove north out of North Carolina, and Hadley was with her good friend. And she said, wow, it's beautiful here. And then they started to see the Trump signs everywhere. And we stayed in a cabin where we heard dogs barking and ATVs going. And then my wife found out that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died, and she screamed like her brother had died. No! And that night was a very difficult night because the girls started to kind of spiral. And my daughter's good friend, LJ, said, they say 2020 is bad, but this is just the beginning. This is the portal to the future. And it was really, really a hard night. And I stayed up most of the night, kind of standing vigil because I was worried, about where we were. But the next morning we started to talk. And I think that feeling that urgency, which Roosevelt felt, feeling the need to, think of how the shit show that we've been in in recent, where it's like this giant distraction every day where there's a new issue and we're getting slammed about. This is a larger issue. This is a larger vision. This is even beyond human beings. This is the biocentric world, the larger world. And we need to keep our eye on it. We need to remind people like, my daughter, who doesn't really need that much reminding, and her friends, that there are larger things than who got canceled today or who got, what the fire is today. And if we don't preserve this world, which Roosevelt, no offense, Teddy, but for all your flaws, you gave us, as I said earlier, a rough draft. Mm-hmm. It's up to us to revise it and make it relevant for now, and mostly for young people. I mean, I've had my fun. I want Hadley to have, for your children's children, right?
And that's, for my part, I would say the final part of my speech from the Grand Canyon, if I may be permitted to give you that. I said, we have gotten past the stage, my fellow citizens, where we are to be pardoned if we treat any part of our country as something to be skinned for 2 or 3 years for the use of the present generation, whether it is the forest or the water or the scenery. Whatever it is, handle it so that your children's children will get the benefit of it. We need to make sure that the profiteers will not get it. So I'm just paraphrasing here at the end, but I want you to preserve the land. And I ended my speech with, preserve them for that use, but use them so that they will not be wasted, so that they will be of benefit to the Arizona of 1953, as well as to the Arizona of 1903.
And 2053.
Yes, we could add that now. Yes.
Because I mean, it's real. I mean, we're not like, this is not some theoretical thing off in the future.
No.
You guys are feeling the fires, we're feeling the hurricanes, we're in it.
Yes.
And it's just obscene not to, you know, it's not a liberal idea to face the facts. And these are the facts that are staring us down right now. And that's why I'm going to run for president after Biden. And my running mate is Theodore Roosevelt.
I'm not certain if there's a limit on dead presidents being able to run for president.
But you gotta, you know, remember you're my vice president.
Oh, that's
so
true.
I
Yes.
Gotta be some interesting loopholes there. Well, thank you both so much, David and Teddy. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everyone out there. Please do consider purchasing a copy of the book. We'll be posting a YouTube video of this if you want to rewatch any part of it or share it on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And we look forward to seeing you at another event soon. Until then, David, Teddy, everyone, please take care.
You as
Have a
well.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been great.